officially live. Now we're live. We're almost there, almost. Now it says setting up your webinar for Facebook Live. All right. Multitasking here. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Betty Cruz, and I'm the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. Really wonderful to be here with you all today, especially to have this conversation, especially in this moment with everything that's going on. We're really thankful to be partnering with PublicSource for today's program. Before we get into it, if you are joining us by Zoom, I shared some of this already, but just as a reminder, please use the chat feature to let us know any questions that you have that come up throughout the program. We're going to be looking to the chat box and pulling those questions to share them with Jourdan as she speaks with our guests. If you're joining us by Facebook Live, please drop in your questions, your feedback, any thoughts that you have in the comments, and we'll also be pulling questions from there. We'll also be adding resources to both locations. We want this to be a conversation that starts today, but that continues to build dialogue as we move forward. The World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh has been around since 1931. We turn 90 next year, and our mission is to provide a pathway for a more globally minded region, offering students and the community a learning space that covers key international issues. Again, we're thrilled to partner with PublicSource, which is a nonprofit, digital-first news organization that delivers public service reporting and analysis in the Pittsburgh region. They're local, they believe in journalism as a public service, and they tell stories for a better Pittsburgh. In May, we at the council launched we went virtual, right, with everyone else, and we launched our public programming series that we're calling Building Back Better. It's language that we're inspired by the World Bank that's used in post-disaster recovery. And for many reasons, this moment is exactly that. And we want to make sure we're learning and reimagining a better future together. And this conversation is one in that series. I'm going to turn it over in a moment here to Jourdan Hicks, who's a lifelong Pittsburgh resident. She's the community correspondent at PublicSource. In addition to her community correspondent work with PublicSource, Jourdan cultivates ideas as a freelance communications and education advisor. She is the host of PublicSource's new podcast, From the Source, and the creator, host, and moderator of the Better Talk Conversation series. Take it away, Jourdan. Thank you all so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's 1:11. That's a good sign. We're so thankful to have all of you here with us today. We're looking forward to the conversation that we're about to embark on. Obviously, you're aware of the topics because you're here and you've seen the flyer, and we're thankful for that. I like to just start off by grounding us and being clear on our intention for this conversation and an outline of kind of how it's going to go. So my responsibility is to guide us as smoothly and effectively through this next hour of conversation. I ask that you make yourselves as comfortable as possible at home. I'm in my living room on the floor. So if you need to get on the floor, please do that. Get you some tea, some water. That just helps with processing all the information and topics we'll be talking about. Take notes. I will also be taking notes and pulling from Post-its. So if you see me kind of like wheeling and dealing and doing a lot of movement, that's what that is. Also, I want to be aware that all of us have been inundated with a lot of media, a lot of news, a lot of audio and visuals that are necessary to see and be aware of, but is also very traumatic. So I do not want to take that lightly. And before we officially begin, I would like us to just do a collective inhale and exhale twice on your own timing. But right before we get started, before we ask any questions, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm going to do that right now. And at any time during this conversation, you may hear something that hits you a certain way in your body. You may find yourself kind of wiggling your toes or twiddling with your fingers as you're processing some information. If that does happen, take notes on that. That's your homework. That is an indication that something is working its way to being settled, but is not quite settled. So please pay attention to those things, take notes. And it's 1:13. We're here until 2, so let's get started. Oh, and one last thing. Today, officially, we are all journalists. Maybe you came into this conversation as a teacher, as someone who works from home, who's a freelancer. Maybe you are a surgeon. Today, you are a journalist. Tuition is paid, no student debt. Congratulations. I think that's the best way for us to enter into this conversation. So mental health has really been at the crux of this conversation, and that's kind of where I want to start out. But before we get started, I would like for Tanya and Carrie Elle to introduce themselves. Tanya, if you could start, and then we'll jump into our questions.
Okay, so hi, my name is Tanya Tapia. I'm a Colombian journalist. I live in Bogota, which is the capital of Colombia. I work at an independent media outlet, which is called 070, which is like 070, which is grounded at the University of Los Andes, which is a big university here in Colombia. I've been a journalist for the last 5 years, more or less, and I've done mostly things on gender issues and LGBTQ and women issues, but I also do a lot of pieces and investigation on social protest and social issues. So yeah, that's what I do. That's who I am.
Should I go ahead?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Carrie Elle. I'm a journalist based in Monrovia, Liberia. I'm a freelancer, so I work for a lot of different Western outlets, and my medium is generally video and photo. I generally have a focus on human interest stories and human rights stories.
Psych, now we're started. As I stated previously, a big piece of this virus, this health crisis that we're all experiencing, outside of your physical health, a part of that conversation has been mental health. And so I think in all of our preparations for this conversation today, there were a few themes that arose that I kind of want to center right before we jump into this mental health question. But the themes that I kind of pulled from our conversations have been the difference between surveillance and gaze, safety, and change. I think across the bat, coronavirus has become synonymous with change. But my first question for you both, and I guess Carrie, you can start out answering this if you can, is how is your newsroom supporting you right now? Are they supporting you in your mental wellness as we're reporting through a health crisis?
So I'm a freelancer. I have a bunch of different newsrooms, and it's good you asked that question because that's this whole element of being a freelancer and kind of feeling like you're on your own is very real. I don't have a newsroom, right? So there's no real editor that feels like they are responsible for me. I have editors that like me, we work together, but there's no one who's saying that they are terribly concerned about my mental health. There's no one checking in about things like that. So that's a challenge that freelancers face.
Tanya?
Should I go? Okay. So for me, I do have a newsroom, and we're very small. We're like 5 or 6 people. So we're very aware of what the others going through. So I think, and it's also because I think at this magazine at 070, we are very aware of these like emotional changes that people are going through during this crisis. So that's something we openly talk about between us. So yeah, we know when someone is upset and we just deal with it and contain it. And yeah, so I think like the mental thing and the emotional stability of the whole team is something that it's always on the table, and we're aware of it. I know that I have like this backup of my colleagues of, yeah, if I'm anxious or if there's a story that I'm having difficulty with for whatever reason, yeah, I think that that's like a safe space.
And Carrie Elle, you've been freelancing for a while now, but this isn't your first rodeo with a health crisis. You were in Liberia in 2014, doing photo essays and video work, capturing how Ebola was coming through Liberia, which was really one of the hardest hit places in West Africa where Ebola was. How has reporting in a health crisis, reporting during Ebola, prepared you for now, or has it prepared you for now?
I think it has prepared me for now. You know, with Corona, it is a different beast. People have been saying, oh, well, you know, you already did Ebola, so Corona should be nothing to you because it's so much less deadly. But that's not really true because it's so much more contagious than Ebola was. So I guess my preparation came from having to be comfortable in a crisis, in a health crisis. Like, you have to kind of center yourself, be calm as you're reporting, because if you're talking to people and you're freaked out and nervous, you're not going to get good content from there. It's going to make them uncomfortable. They're not going to want to talk to you. So one thing I learned during Ebola was how to like stay calm. Also, I learned how to protect myself and pay attention to surfaces, touching different surfaces. And most importantly, I learned how to be sensitive to people in crisis. I think a lot of times journalists kind of pop into places and someone's in crisis. And so for us, it's like, oh, wow, okay, let's go get that story. That's that thing that we should go get. And we're not considering the fact that this is a person who is having real human emotions because their mother or their father or whichever loved one is having a hard time and might be dying. So I think I learned a lot of sensitivity during Ebola coverage. I think that's important because a lot of us, too many of us don't have it. We just want the story.
Right. And just for some perspective, Ebola claimed the lives of, I think, almost 5,000 people in Liberia compared to coronavirus now in Liberia. There's been 311 cases confirmed and 28 deaths. In Colombia, there's been 31,000 confirmed cases. 11,000 people have recovered, and unfortunately, 1,000 people have lost their lives. And so, actually, I want to do it like this, just from non-verbally. Could you answer this question? Are you guys still under restriction? Yes. If I was in Liberia or Colombia, could I get my nails done? Like right now? No. Legally, could I get to go to a shop and get my nails done?
I mean, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
you could. Yeah.
Could I eat at a restaurant? No, Tania.
No.
Carrie Elle, could I eat at a restaurant in Liberia?
Yeah. Yes. So last week, President Weah kind of changed the restrictions a bit. Before, the restrictions were that you just could not be in a restaurant. Now he's restricted them to just a couple people, you know, tables have to be far away, but you can be in a restaurant. There's a 6 p.m. curfew though.
Okay. Is there curfew in Colombia or in Bogota?
There's curfew in some places in Colombia or in Bogota, for example. There's this big neighborhood, which is bigger than actually it's several neighborhoods, but they have so many cases that they have curfew, but we all have like this quarantine, which is not the same as curfew. I mean, we can go out any time. The restrictions, like, yeah, they change a little bit depending on where you are.
And just for a reference for our audience, so in Colombia, it's a little different than, or how they're doing restrictions is a little bit different than ours. So from what I understand, Tania, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the president makes the distinctions for how we are going to operate under quarantine. And then mayors of cities are allowed to decide how they're going to implement those restrictions and changes. So the restrictions in Medellin versus Bogota are different. So to put that in a Pittsburgh American context, if that was the case here, the restrictions in Pittsburgh would be different from the restrictions in Braddock and Monroeville and any other city or borough. In your
Exactly.
chat section, how do you all feel like that would go if we had different restrictions based on the city and boroughs we lived in versus statewide restrictions? I'm curious to know. So Tanya, so what are the restrictions that the government put into place to mitigate people contracting coronavirus?
Okay, so the restrictions actually just changed since the beginning of this month. And it's actually much more flexible because you have the quarantine, but you have like 47 or 43 exceptions where you can go out. Those exceptions have been since the beginning of the quarantine, like for grocery shopping, or if you have like a medical emergency, if you need to take care of people, for example, yeah, I don't know, kids or someone somewhere else that needs to be taken care of, so you can go out if that's your case. But also with this like new stage of quarantine here, there's some jobs and some like financial industries that can go out. So for example, manufacturing, some construction. So there's a lot more people out, but it's not yet like back to normal. So for example, we don't have restaurants. We do have like salons, for example, because I don't know, I think that's a very Colombian thing. Like everybody gets their nails done, and yeah. So we have like things like that. Very few businesses that are allowed to open. But if you don't get into those 40 something exceptions, which is like, I don't know, for example, the car industry also is allowed to go out and start operating. You can't go out. You only can go out right now if you need to do some grocery shopping, or if you need to go to a drugstore, or if you have like a medical emergency.
And Carrie Elle, I understand in Monrovia there were curfew restrictions, schools are closed, but what does the quarantine restrictions look like now?
So the quarantine restrictions now are that everyone's allowed to be out between 6 and 6. So they extended the restrictions by 3 hours. So that's kind of helped things for people a little bit more because it's a full work day. Before, there were stores that couldn't be open. Only essential stores were open in terms of like supermarkets, hotels were open, but the restaurants weren't really. So basically non-essential stores were not open. Now they are open, and they're just asking that you only have a certain number of customers in the store.
Okay, so there's no restrictions as far as people needing passes to go out.
After 6 p.m. you need a pass to go out.
Okay.
And what ends up happening, of course, with anything like this is that sometimes people are giving passes to friends.
Okay. All right, so we expected this to happen. We're working in like 3 different time zones. So we're going to give Carrie Elle some time to come back, but also I'm going to continue and ask Tanya, there was a very controversial restriction that was put in place by the mayor of Bogota. Could you tell us some more about Pico y Género and how that worked?
So, well, as you were saying before, how it works here is that you have the president, which, and he says, okay, there's going to be a quarantine, but each mayor in each city has the ability to say how that restriction is going to be applied to their cities. So here in Bogota, which is like the biggest city in Colombia, we have like 8, almost 9 million people here in Bogota. The mayor, which is Claudia Lopez, which is a woman, and actually is the first lesbian woman who's gotten to the mayor position. She established that what she was going to do was to restrict the people who could go out based on their gender. So by calendar on odd days, the men could go out, and on even days, the women could go out. So that what she said is that that restriction made it easier for policemen to control visually who could be on the streets or not, and also reduce the quantity of people that were out on the streets. And that was like 28 days that that restriction was functioning here in Bogota. And it was, since she said she was gonna do that, there was a lot of critics from social organizations and LGBTQ organizations, because it was clearly something that was gonna directly affect trans people, because trans people are, I mean, there are, because the restriction was gonna like make gender something that policemen could control. And so if you had a trans person, there were going to be problems. And
Right, because they were looking at gender in the
Exactly.
binary way, and obviously gender diverse
Exactly.
people are not binary. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was also complicated because here in Colombia, most, or I mean, a big part of the violence that trans people suffer is caused by the police. I mean, it's the police who, yeah, the ones who do the violence. So there were a lot of critics that it was going to be violent, that there were going to be problems, but they went anyway ahead and did it. And the restriction was just, yeah, we've been like 3 weeks without the restriction, but it was a whole month that we had to live with it.
And there were some really serious things that happened, centering discrimination and loss of life based on this restriction. There was someone who was out and didn't present as, I guess, the public or a neighbor felt they should have based on their gender, and told this person that they were out on the wrong day and assaulted them, stabbed them.
Yeah.
Because they felt like this man was out. Maybe that was insensitive, I'm sure. If it was insensitive, I apologize. But this male presenting person was out on a Women's Day, and that caused an issue, correct?
Yeah, exactly. That's what happened. There was this trans woman who was out on the Women's Day, and this neighbor who had harassed her before stabbed her because, yeah, he said it was not the right day for her for her to come out. So that was yeah, that was like the worst case of violence and discrimination, and it was because of the restriction, because the attacker mentioned the restriction when he attacked her. So the social, the LGBTQ communities and organizations said, okay, this is the proof that this restriction is somehow like backing up this kind of violence, and we should remove it, but they didn't. The mayor office, they were very, I mean, they were very aware of all the discrimination cases that were out, and they were doing like a good work. Like, for example, with the man, they caught him, but they let the restriction functioning anyway. So that was like a very big critique. Yeah.
So, Carrie Elle, we were just discussing the response to the restriction of mobility based on gender that was in place in Bogota. Were there any adverse or negative responses to the restrictions in Monrovia by the people that you could speak about?
When you say adverse responses, you mean difficulty people faced because of the restrictions?
difficulties they experience, or any negative sentiments that the public had concerning the restrictions.
Yeah, so Liberia has a fairly large part of the population that lives day to day. Many people live below the poverty line. And so for many people, they go out every day and work. A lot of people are day laborers. A lot of people are working in the restaurant industry. A lot of people are basically selling things on the street, marketers, we call them, market people, market women. And so for a lot of those people, when you have something like Corona, people were already not really out as much. So because they weren't out as much, there were fewer customers. The ones who were out didn't want necessarily to buy food from a stranger because they didn't know how they prepare it. And there's lots of misinformation of how you get Corona in the first place. Or they just didn't want to be touching things that a stranger was touching. And those people, when they're selling, they're interacting with a ton of people. They're touching different money. There's like tons of ways to transmit disease essentially. So a lot of people didn't want to be bothered with buying from them. They talked about how they had fewer customers. And so there's been a lot of complaints about that because they were like, how are we supposed to live? A young guy in one of the poor communities came out and told me, we're gonna have to start robbing people. Now, he didn't mean we as in the people in the poor community. He meant like he and his friends, like him very specifically, because we have these boys here that we call Zogos essentially, which are young guys who have had it rough in life and they basically turn to crime. And so he was someone who was telling me, I am someone who's going to have to resort to crime if no one's going to help me, because basically the petty labor that I normally do, I can't do anymore. And it was so shocking to see how honest he was being, but he called me over for the interview. He asked for it because he wanted me to tell people we need help. And if we don't get help, you're gonna be who's gonna be affected essentially. The second part of that is market women. I talked to one woman in the market and she basically just laid out for me how at every step along the way, she was struggling. She said, okay, first of all, now that you guys are saying that only 2 people can get in this certain vehicle, and before public transportation, you had 2, because we have these little tuk-tuks that go around. And now they were saying there was only 2 who could be in the vehicles instead of 3. She said, the taxi drivers and tuk-tuk drivers make us pay for that extra seat. So those prices go up. Secondly, in the market, fewer people are coming because they're afraid of Corona, because it's way more contagious than Ebola and people are terrified because we've already been through one health crisis. She said, but on top of that, schools are closed, businesses are closed. So people who come and buy, she sold dry fish. And she was like, people who come and buy from me, my dry fish, they're not coming anymore because they don't have customers at the schools. They don't have customers at their restaurants. So at every step, she was talking about how she was losing money. And even in the market, like I said, she was saying that people didn't come, so she would have to take all her goods back. And she spent money to buy those goods in the first place. And she had kids to support. Her husband was a government worker, and a lot of non-essential government offices were closed. So he wasn't making much money, at least that's how it sounded. I didn't understand why though. But so it just at every step along the way, she was like telling me things that I hadn't even considered as someone who thankfully is privileged enough to not have to think about all those things. So it was funny because an epidemiologist called Masoka Falah, he was a leader in the fight against Ebola. Now he's working on Corona. He said it's interesting because Ebola was often transmitted from poor people to people with privilege. And he was like, in this case, we are the ones who gave people Corona, because a lot of poor Liberians were not traveling to go anywhere. We went to different places, to our conferences, on vacations. We brought it back into the country, and then we're giving it to the people that we interact with. And so it's our responsibility to make sure that we do things to help them, like food programs and stuff for people who aren't able to go out and hustle.
I want to pivot a little bit because this reminds me of some conversation we had in our pre-interview process around how almost coronavirus has been something of an equalizer or a frame of reference that we can all understand. So when Ebola happened, Ebola was something that happened from an American standpoint, that happened over there. Coronavirus is everywhere. It's here, it's in Colombia, it's in Liberia, it's in Italy, it's everywhere, right? Do you see a difference in the public sentiment around coronavirus for yourself, coronavirus versus Ebola, especially as someone who does a lot of international reporting and working with large international, well-respected media organizations?
oh yes. Yeah, we
us
did
about
talk
it.
about this, and this was something that I really wanted to touch on because I think it's so important. During Ebola, first off, you had large, again, portions of the population here in Liberia that weren't very educated. And in the early days, to be honest, the government didn't do a great job of educating and sensitizing people. All they saw was people in moon suits whose faces they couldn't see coming up, taking their sick relatives. They would go into an Ebola treatment center. And then at the time, if the person died, they would get cremated. You never saw them again, which is horrifying. So people were running away from healthcare workers. Sometimes they were stoning them. They were afraid. And there were all these theories about how the government was stealing organs. So long story short, there was a lot of pushback and resistance. And because of that, of course, people stayed home. They infected people in the home. And that was how Ebola spread. I mean, lots of different reasons, but that was a big one. So when you looked on, we would post stories and all that, and we would look at comments on Facebook, on social media, and you're seeing people saying these horrible things like we're all these savages who just couldn't get it together, and that's why the disease was spreading. And a little bit of a hint, I mean, some came out and said it, but even the ones who didn't say it, there was a little bit of a hint of, well, you're kind of asking for this, right? Because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And to me, it was just so interesting to see Corona and seeing the same things, right? It's hard to get people to listen to rules and to follow rules. And I think now people are seeing, oh, wait a minute, actually, this is a human condition. It's not just that the Africans weren't listening, because we have kids in America who are educated, going off on spring break and getting people infected. So for me, it was just good to finally, and I don't mean good, obviously it's horrible, it's a pandemic, but I hope that one good thing that comes out of this is that people are more sensitive about how they look at things going on in other places in the world, because we're seeing that we're not that different. People are hard to get to follow rules anywhere.
Right. Tanya, this next question is for you. Colombia is on the backside, the other side of a long fought 50-year, almost like civil war, where there were many factions, but specifically it was the Colombian government, FARC, which was a rebel group, and then some other like ancillary paramilitary guerrilla groups. And prior to Corona, there had been a peace treaty in 2016 with certain promises to unify the country, to make sure that people who were living in poverty had resources to get out of poverty. But just a few months ago, I understand that there was some backpedaling on the part of the Colombian government to honor some of those peace agreements that they had agreed to. Do you think that Corona is halting some of those promises being met, or impacting people, the rate at which people are seeing the results of this peace treaty, basically?
Oof. I mean, there's so many things happening at the same time. Because I mean, what you have here is that there's a big part of this peace agreements. What's the word used? Peace treaty? Yeah, okay, so yeah.
Peace treaty, peace agreement.
Okay, great. So one part of that is because the whole internal conflict here in Colombia, a big part of it is based on cocaine and cocaine production. So it's based on plantations of the coca plant. So these agreements, a big part of them was to agree with the local people who have these coca plants to replace them with some other products, because they're poor and they live off from coca plant. So that was an agreement, like they were going to do it voluntarily and replace the coca with cacao and some other things. But the thing is that since last year, yeah, we have this president who is from the right-wing party, and this party was the one who was always against the peace agreement with the guerrilla. So since he got, he went into the presidency, he's like taking the support and the work from that should be happening now with the peace agreement. So that's been happening since he got to the presidency. But with coronavirus, I think what has happened is that these places in Colombia where you have like these coca plantations are places that are completely forgotten from the government. You have no law or any state presence there. And historically, the ones who have exerted, I don't know if that's the word, the power or the control, like the ones who have organized those places are the guerrillas, yeah, like these, the other groups, not the state. And what you get with Corona, or what we're seeing here, is that those places that have been forgotten from the state presence are even more forgotten. So you have the poverty augmented, you have violence augmented, because since you don't have the state and the state is worried about coronavirus, those legal groups get to do whatever they want. So we've seen also a race on on recruitation of kids and teenagers to these armed groups. So you have like this big specter of problems and chaos happening mostly in those regions, like the peripheral part of Colombia, where
More
it's
rural
most
parts.
rural, exactly, rural. Yeah, so the coronavirus definitely has like augmented to that lack of state presence there, and it's been the opportunity for illegal armed groups to regain control and violence in those regions.
Okay. To our audience, thank you for sticking with us. If you have any questions, please continue to submit them in the chat. I did want to ask one question. I guess, Carrie Elle, you can answer this, or Tanya, however you feel. Coronavirus is always obviously at the center of all of our attention, right? Is there anything that's not being reported the way that it should be reported that's happening because of coronavirus, or things kind of like what's happening in Colombia with the peace agreement, and the government supposedly honoring the agreement to take care of like more rural areas and trade out agriculture so they can make money, but not support the cocaine production or the plant that leads to the cocaine production. Is there anything that's kind of like sliding beneath the radar that we should be paying attention to, or that we're missing? Carrie Elle?
Yeah, in Liberia, and I actually just got a call from one of my sources today. There was some good news. In Liberia, we've had a situation where a couple police and security people are overreaching and doing some sketchy things in the name of policing people because of Corona. Market people have told me about how police will come to them and be like, because basically, you know, a lot of the marketers do kind of post up wherever they can, and they're trying to make money fast and go home before curfew. And so police have come and they'll take their things. And, you know, again, these are people who don't have much in the first place, and they'll take their things and confiscate them because they're like, well, you're not supposed to be here. And then they have to go somewhere and pay a whole bunch of money to get their stuff back. And when they get it back, some of it's not even there. So there's been sketchy stuff like that. The second thing that's been happening, and this is much more serious, is that police and security forces have been seeing people who maybe are out past curfew, or even sometimes they're on the porch and they're like, oh, why aren't you inside? And being violent with them. I want to make it very clear that these are rare cases, but a woman got a really bad laceration on her arm from some type of scuffle. And I was so happy to hear that this army guy, I don't know his role, I'm sorry, but he ended up getting court-martialed, at least the Liberian equivalent of getting court.
Okay, Tanya.
Marshaled. And
there she
he
is.
now is like, sadly, that doesn't happen a lot. So I was really, you see me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. So you were saying that in this specific case, someone was held accountable. They were court-martialed. There was a process with some sort of action applied at the end.
Yeah, and that is rare. Normally people, if there's some type of power hungry, police officer or whatever, they might start whipping people with sticks and all that, saying, get out of the street. I followed police one day during one of these kind of like lockdown, what do you call them? Like where they're just kind of looking, I'm missing the word right now. Yeah, like where they're patrolling, lockdown patrol, right? A lockdown patrol. And I was actually surprised because unlike other times where there's been lockdowns, they were actually being really good about it. So I was surprised, I have to say, to hear these stories, but hearing them and knowing how police are and security forces are here, I was not surprised at all. So, but I was surprised at the fact that there had been some action because a lot of times that doesn't happen.
Really quick, Tanya, in Colombia, would you say is it normal for example, you said that there was this fraught relationship between the gender diverse community and law enforcement in Bogota. Is it normal for police officers to be held accountable for any negative interactions that they may have with that specific community or people in general?
Not really. Yeah, not really. Actually, with all that's been happening over there in the US, with the riots and there are many people who are also saying, because I mean it's in the media, so people all over the world, or here in Colombia, it's like doing this whole Black Lives Matter also, and there are people who are saying, okay, let's remember that that's also happening here, and most of the policemen and army men and this abuse that comes from the authorities, they don't get held accountable. We have this riot force here, which is called SMAD, which is supposed to intervene when there are violence in manifestations, and they've killed people. Actually, we did at 070, we did like a couple of pieces about the SMAD, and the police came after us, like we're doing like some, like we got some mails telling us like, could you please consider taking that content off of the page and of the website. So no, there's no like responsibility that to like take responsibility from the abuses of the army and policemen. And actually recently there was a pretty big scandal because the army was illegally tap wiring and investigating journalists here in Colombia. And there was actually a US journalist who did a big investigation here in Colombia from the New York Times, who was also being investigated by the army. And that was like, yeah, that was legal. And I mean, what all the officers say is that we didn't know that was happening inside our organization, but you don't know. So yeah, there's a lot of impunity here.
So impunity for law enforcement and army officers not being held accountable. This sounds really familiar. I'm wondering, so what is the relationship in Liberia between the government and reporters? Like, is it a fraught relationship like it is here? I don't know, is it as contentious? Is it less contentious?
I would say less contentious at times. I started to say less contentious and I remembered some things. Generally, it's less contentious. But there have been times where spokespeople for President Weah have definitely kind of pushed back and made veiled threats and not so veiled threats. And that surprised people. And thankfully the public has, and that's how it's different from America. Thankfully the public has been like, that's not gonna fly here. Whereas I feel like in America, a lot of people on the far right are like kind of siding with Trump when he says these crazy things about journalists. Here, people are siding with journalists and saying that that's not acceptable. In February, I believe it was, there was this big protest where journalists were saying, hey, your security forces attack us when we go to certain events. And it's true. In the name of protecting the president, sometimes people will throw their weight around and just essentially hit journalists, shove journalists, do things that they shouldn't do. They've seized people's cameras, all types of things. There was one case that was very controversial because, of course, the autopsy here didn't prove that his death was inspired by police action, but this man got beaten up by security forces. He was a journalist who was very critical of the government. There was no evidence that that was why they beat him up, but he was at an event. He got into some type of disagreement about where he could be, and security forces, as they often do, used way too much force and started beating up on him. He had chest pains, chest problems, and the next couple of days he died. Now, he did have pre-existing conditions, but that was what really pushed journalists to say, okay, this is enough. And that was how the protest started.
So obviously we are, I started off this conversation by saying that we're all journalists. And I say that because journalists, reporters, because more than likely you have posted something, prepared a Facebook post, retweeted, reposted a video, shot photos to tell someone about something that has happened. You've created a story based on these resources that you've had. That's reporting, that's journalism. As journalists who are outside of the United States, and I could be reaching with this, but the sentiment in the United States is that we understand that people in other countries at one point or another look to the United States as a place of refuge, inspiration, the place where you come and make it happen, all of these things. But now I'm wondering, how is the rest of the world seeing us with the protests and the revolting and the violence and the friction? So I want to know from you two, how would you report what's happening in America, in the United States currently, to your network, to your constituents, to your readership in Colombia, in Liberia? Tanya, if you don't mind starting off.
Well, as I was saying before, I think there's been a valuable exercise here, which is that people is also like getting this news from the US and saying, let's remember that happens here too. So, I mean, I think we get what's happening in the US like pretty directly because of all the cultural references and yeah, I mean, the music we hear is there's a lot of music that comes from the US, the series, the movies. So you have, for example, in Instagram, these celebrities or people that you follow, which are from the US, and they're telling you what's happening there. So you kind of feel it like it's not like super foreign. It's something that's almost like really close to you because you've grown up seeing these US movies and this series and hearing this music, so you know what they're talking about. So, I mean, I think people almost, you don't need, I mean, the media is obviously doing these pieces about what's happening in the US and people here are reading those things, but you get your information from Instagram, from Twitter, directly from the people who are there, like retweeting these videos and reposting these videos that we've seen this last days. So I think as a journalist, the responsibility is to give context to that information that people is already getting through social media. So, and context is also giving them context on remembering what's happening around you. So it's okay, we have this thing in the US, but actually, for example, today and since yesterday, there's been there's been like this photo of this young man who was murdered by the police here in Colombia. But since we get that happening almost like really frequently, we forget and we become numbed to this news. But then you have George Floyd and these influential people are talking about racism and how police are killing Black people, and then you can say, okay, let's remember Black people die here too by the police, which is this young man that I'm talking about. So yeah, I think as a journalist, it's, or for me, the focus must be also to like take it. I mean, it's not take advantage, but just like surf this wave of attention that is getting the violence and the effects of racism, and just throwing some light into the things that have been shadowed and that are happening right next to us. So that for me would be like that's what I would do as a journalist.
And I'm specifically interested to hear about what the Liberian perspective, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, but maybe you guys know, maybe you guys don't know, you all know in our audience that Liberia was a country that was founded by former enslaved Black folk from the Caribbean and from the United States who went back to Africa and founded Liberia. Monrovia, which is the capital of Liberia, is named after James Monroe, a former American president. So go ahead. I just wanted to like give context.
Yeah, thank you. So what's been interesting in Liberia, and I think that a lot of that has to do with social media, is that people before were we always just kind of looked up to America, right? We called America our big brother. There's anytime, you know, someone's trying to kind of take advantage of our rights or whatever, we bring up the fact that, you know, Liberia's constitution is shaped after America's constitution and we have rights and all that. And yes, for us, I don't know about the rest of the world, but for us, Liberia definitely looks to America for guidance, and especially with human rights things, we look to America and we say, hey, they're doing it this way. And sometimes people push back with that, with cultural things, but specifically in Liberia, it's been interesting to see people for the first time. There's this joke that's been going around. People say, oh, this is the first time where Liberians aren't rushing to go to America. This is the first time where Liberians aren't, you know, looking at America like, oh, I want to rush there. Because between the lack of leadership with Corona and now the police brutality, Liberians for the first time, and this is, I think, also thanks to social media, because a lot of them get their news from, we get our news from that. I think that for the first time, we're like, oh, wait a minute, actually, you guys have your issues too. And I heard this guy on the radio yesterday, and I was so proud. I didn't even know what his name was because I tuned in too late. But he was going off and talking about how crazy it was, how inappropriate it was for police to behave that way in the great United States. And so it's been really good to kind of see Liberians, you know, where I'm living, saying, hey, wait a minute, okay, this country doesn't have all the answers, and we do still know right from wrong. Just because this place that we've been looking to for guidance is doing things this way, we still know that these things are wrong. And at the same time, I think people are encouraged by seeing young people getting in the streets and mobilizing because of things like police brutality.
Okay, so it's around the time for us to wrap up. That went super fast.
I know. And
go ahead.
The one thing, remember, we talked about this, and I wanted to bring it up because I think it's so important. And Tanya, I don't know how it's been for you in terms of Colombia, how people have reported on crisis there. But we talked about this idea of the double standard in reporting that I wanted to touch on just a little bit, if I can.
We are sharing space. Go ahead.
Okay. What has been interesting for me with Corona, and I would challenge everyone here today to look into this and talk to your friends about it and make this a discussion and ask why it's happening. When Ebola happened in West Africa, and when I think about all the other health crises that happened in South America and Africa and Asia, a lot of times there's a lack of dignity in how locals are photographed and filmed. It's a kind of anything goes photography and journalism. And there's always that element of, oh, well, we're doing this for activism. We're doing this because we're trying to shine a light. We're doing this because we're trying to bring attention to this. So it was interesting that for the first time really in recent history, there's been a mass crisis that Westerners and white people are suffering from. And, you know, they're the victims. And it's been interesting to see how delicately and how respectfully they're being photographed, as they should be. But now we have a chance to go, hey, wait a minute, you were doing it this way for us, and now you're doing it this way for them. Why? So I would just challenge everyone to start paying attention to the reporting. Take some time to Google how past epidemics were photographed, and now that we're in a pandemic, see how people are photographing people in Western countries. That's a challenge for you.
To our newly minted group of journalists. Yes. Tanya, is there anything else that you wanted to leave with us, or any final words that you want to make sure that we hear before we kind of depart from this space?
Yeah, regarding to what you just said, Carrie Elle, I was thinking that what's been happening here in Colombia, and I think that something that would be interesting for people to take with them is the look we have towards poverty. Because here, the media, what they, I mean, not all of them, but some like TV channels, they romanticize poverty, which is, I mean, in the context of coronavirus. So, for example, we have this piece of news that were like little kids who found like a broken computer, and the piece was they make their own computer and they play they have a computer, something like that, which is a way of saying like, look, there are these poor people who are, in despite of all, like going through life, and they're so like hard workers despite of coronavirus. And it's, I think that's the really wrong how do you say that, that's like the wrong perspective to see it. I mean, what coronavirus should or must making us reflect on is that there are poor people that have been there since always, and this crisis should be useful to remember that those people have those conditions which should not be there, that we should do something, that governments should redistribute the money, the richness, I don't know how you say that in English, but it's remembering that you have those people that are living really poorly, and not like, in spite of all their difficulties, they're going ahead and it's remember our responsibilities. And us as journalists, we should keep that in mind. That is not like telling uplifting stories in among the crisis, and the showing the people who read the news how these poor people, if they can make it, you can make it. No, it's remember it that there's something wrong and there are structural problems, and this crisis should be useful for that.
Yeah, I think that these types of health crises always shine a light on the gaps, right, in the health system, and how the poor people are always the ones who suffer the most.
Yeah, I agree with you both. I definitely agree with you both. So it is now time for us to wrap up. Thank you so much for your insights and sharing your experiences with us. To our audience, thank you for joining us. I just want to remind you, I think Betty mentioned this at the top of the hour, that there is a survey that we're requesting that you participate in. Sorry, I know people are like, surveys suck, but we wouldn't have asked you to do the survey if we didn't think you would have information to impart to us, and if we didn't think you would like enjoy this situation and take something away from it. So please engage in the survey afterwards. If you have any questions, please continue to ask those on the Facebook page, on the event page. We have some resources that are going to be sent out, things that Carrie Elle has been a part of, pieces that Tanya have written. So please check those out as well. So the next time we're going to do this is going to be on the 5th at 8:30 a.m. to 9:15 a.m., where the conversation is going to be from bow ties to face masks. I'm intrigued. How a local business is responding to COVID-19. Again, that's going to be on Friday, June 5th, 8:30 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. You can find more of my work at PublicSource.org. Please tune in to our podcast. It's lit. And you can find any coverage on the coronavirus pandemic on publicsource.org. Thank you for joining us. Be well, choose joy, and do something that matters today, that actually matters and makes a difference outside of posting and reposting. That's my message for us all. Thanks, guys. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be safe.
Be safe.